and welcome to this week's episode of the Goodrum Show with me, Chris Goodrum. As per usual, a big thank you to everybody that watched last week's episode of the show, liked, commented, all that kind of stuff. Yep, Dilbardine, that was a fun one. And talking of fun episodes of the show, as promised, Fettercairn time. Yeah, now, I can blame J.R. Lancelot for this one. J.R. is a long-standing viewer, kindly sent me a number of samples some months ago in actual fact, and they were a bit of a mixed bunch, including the 16-year-old Distillery release, and I thought, yeah, okay. One's experience with Fettercairn, shall we say, does... well, they're not a member of the Axis of Evil for nothing, it has to be said. So, kicking off this week's episode of the show, we will play a little bit of a game, a bit of word association. So I'm going to say a word, and I'd like to know the first word that sort of crops into your head. So, here we go. Fettercairn. Burnt rubber? No? Okay, let's try that one again then, shall we? Fettercairn. Caramel. Yeah? No? Okay. I will explain. Now, the problem with Fettercairn is sulphur. And the thing is, the sort of sulphur in itself is not a bad thing, as we well know. And, you know, give it long enough in the casks, it will remove most of it, and some of it will come across as that kind of nice, rich, meaty kind of character. Now, unfortunately, most independent bottling companies that bottled Fettercairn had this fetish for bottling it at a rather young age, and you know, you're getting the whole caboodle, shall we say. Now, why is Fettercairn so solid? I mean, it in theory, right? Okay, you look at Goodrum's second rule of whiskey, as you well know, is pretty distillery equals pretty spirit. So, although I wouldn't say Fettercairn is a pretty distillery, it's a very distillery-looking distillery, if you like. You know, very classical, I suppose. It's certainly not an ex-industrial tin shack or something of that kind of ilk. So you know, it shouldn't be really producing that type of spirit, should it? Well, but the problem is, of course, that it has two sets of stills, and they're both short, fat, stubby, you know, and so we're not talking a great deal of reflux to start off with. Then they were linked up to stainless steel condensers. I mean, admittedly, they have been replaced by, in 2009, I think it was, the standard sort of copper ones. So stainless steel condensers, well, again, practically no reflux there whatsoever. Now, they did sort of fit cooling jackets around the spirit stills to sort of like trickle water down them, but well, you know, that's really not had a great deal of effect, to be bluntly honest with. And the thing is that sort of obviously sulphur takes on a number of different guises. It's not all about that kind of struck match kind of characteristic. It can have a slightly sort of dirtiness, shall we say. It can sometimes come across quite herbal and sort of vegetal, with sort of like cabbagey sort of off notes and things, and they're the ones that sort of that Richard Patterson, has the head blender for White and Mackay, who own the distillery, has gone on record as saying that he had a real fight with when trying to sort of like, you know, tame it, and his answer was to basically throw lots of first fill and virgin American oak at it. From tasting a number of the distillery releases, certainly the no age statement ones, I have to say I think that their approach has actually been more like vast amounts of E150. You know, yeah, if you're going to basically have a sort of a young sulphury spirit, just mask it. And of course, obviously, there are other distilleries in the White and Mackay portfolio that steal all the sherry casks, and so poor old Fettercairn doesn't get any. So yes, yeah, left with the E150. Now, I will say that I haven't tasted a distillery bottling of Fettercairn or a no age statement distillery or entry level bottling of distillery for a number of years. So I don't know whether that is still a truism, shall we say, but certainly in my experience it has been. So, guess there's not really a huge amount more to say, apart from, like I said, there's a number of independent bottlings here in front of me. They are all I think they're all pre-2009, and they're all really young, and pretty much most of them have been, as you can see from the colour, certainly that one, practically, well, no oak, probably it was probably aged in a stainless steel container, I think. I don't know about an oak, but or a container. But so we're going to get the full-on Fettercairn experience. So strap yourself down and let's have a look at the lineup. Right, so as I said, independent bottling companies certainly used to have a fetish for bottling Fettercairn at a young age, so you could get the full-on experience. And well, why not? You know, let's put it this way. You know, you can't argue that, well, that the distillery doesn't have any character. Whether you like that character, of course, or not, of course, is a completely different meaning. But anyway, so we're going to kick off with a 6-year-old. So this is a Hunter Laing Hepburns Choice Fettercairn. It was bottled or distilled in 2008. These are all quite old samples, by the way. Bottled in September of 2015. Aged in a bourbon quarter cask or quarter casks. I can't remember. I think the Hepburn's Choice range were batches, but they never used to say. Anyway, so that is that bottling. The internal code for those of you that know these things was HEP0113. On to the second bottling, not much older. This is a 7-year-old. This was bottled in the Carn more strictly limited range. It was distilled in 2009, bottled in 2016. Again, 46%, and this time a reef-charred bourbon hogshead. Again, from memory, I think the strictly limited range often tended to be a batch bottling, sometimes 2-3 casks, so that'll be interesting to see what that's like. Right, on to the first of the single cask releases. So this is a 10-year-old, steady on there. This was bottled in Douglas McGibbon's Provenance range, so that shows you how old this particular bottling is. It is a refill bourbon hogshead, DMG 10943, distilled in April of 2005 and bottled in October of 2015. Second bottling is another bottling, but this time it's the Douglas McGibbon Provenance range, obviously from when the two companies split, if you remember. So this was again refill bourbon, a refill bourbon barrel, DMG 10416, distilled in March of 2003, bottled in September of 2014. Penultimate bottling is again a Hunter Laing, back to the good old Hunter Laing. This is in their Distillers Art range. I don't know whether they still make the bottle in that particular range. It was they never seemed to bottle an awful lot in that particular range, and I never kind of understood what. I mean, it's bottled at 48%, whereas obviously sort of like, you know, you had the 46%, then you had OMC at 50%. It did seem to be a bit of a kind of why, but anyway, refill bourbon hogshead, distilled in June of 2002, bottled in August of 2016. Internal reference number was ART0077, and then on to the final bottling from, like I said, sample from J.R. Lancelot. This is the Fettercairn 16-year-old, third release of 2022, bottled at 46.4%. First one to actually feature anything other than American oak, as you can see from the colour. So this is a vatting of Oloroso, PX and bourbon. So obviously got some age, got some sherry there to kind of like, you know, again hide some of that. Hopefully the sulphur is kind of, you know, dissipated to a certain extent, and we'll see. It's most of the time, like I said, I tasted sort of no age statement, and I think the oldest, I think, age statement bottling of Fettercairn I think I ever tasted was a 12-year-old. But anyway, so I think that should be a bit of an interesting one to finish on. So deep breath, let's kick off with the young'un. Okay, so let's kick off with the Hepburn's Choice 6-year-old. Let's see what the nose gives on this one, shall we? Now, you know what? It's actually not too bad. I mean, there's quite a bit of oak there, because it is a bourbon quarter cask. So that's obviously, this is playing into Richard Patterson's idea of what to do with the spirit quite adroitly, shall we say. It's got quite a lot of vanilla, quite a lot of sweet oak, which is making the barley feel quite sweet, which is quite surprising. There's some almost honeyed notes, there's some white fruit. Dear God, is this really Fettercairn? There is a little herbal vegetal note there on the edge. There is that sort of slightly industrial note. But you know what? Actually, that's pretty well balanced. It has some distillery character, but not too much. Plenty of oak. Purists might argue a little bit too much oak, but I think in this instance, I will forgive the excess amount of oak because it does indeed temper the distillery character. Yeah. Yeah, so that's that. Still quite oaky, not so much vanilla, more tannins, more tightness, more industrial character, short, little green fruit on the finish, clean, little sour fruit, more industrial on the palate, more distillery character, less oak on the palate, but again the oak seems to have added a little bit of sweetness there, so actually a pretty good bottling. Oh my God. Right, okay, so let's move on to the Carn Moor 7-year-old. So this is a recharred bourbon hoggy. Let's see what the natives on this end, shall we? Don't get much oak at all, to be honest with you. I mean, it's looking at the colour, you would expect more oak on the nose, but I'm not getting it. I'm getting this kind of slightly vinegary, acetic, almost kind of mescal-y kind of nose. There's a little bit of apricot. I can smell some charred wood, but it is front and centre spirit character. So purists will love it. It's cool. It is quite hard going. I mean, if you like tequila and mezcal and stuff like that, you'd probably really get off on this. If that's not your bag, then God, it's hard work, it has to be said. Yeah, that oak is really not adding very much in the way of vanilla. Let's see what passes on. Oh, that's astringent. Oh, I can feel things closing up, shall we say. Well, it kicks off with more oak, so you get this almost fleeting sort of oaky vanilla sweetness, and then that suddenly disappears as you hit the mid palate, and in comes that character. It's that sort of green, acerbic, mescal-y, tequila-y, sort of pulped white fruit, puckering finish, it has to be said, you know, that sort of acetic sort of slightly sulphuriness is kind of going, ooh, mother. Again, it's not horrendous. It's not, like I said, the sulphur comes across in that sort of greenness as opposed to that sort of, you know, overt kind of struck match kind of character. And although, again, it encapsulates the character of the distillery, that palate was, ooh, yeah. Right, okay, so let's move on to the Douglas McGibbon Provenance 10-year-old. Right, okay, yep, there's absolutely no oak, but there's not a great deal of character either. It's very, there's a little wisp of citrus, some white licorice, a little bit of ginger, a little bit of barley. I mean, it's kind of, Yeah, I'm starting to get that greenness coming through now, that sort of slightly kind of vinegary sort of greenness. It's just taking a little while to kind of get going, but it's not the most expressive of noses, it has to be said. In actual fact, you really have to kind of work hard at it. I mean, it might be because the sample has lost some of its intensity, because it is obviously, well, 10 years old, and there wasn't exactly a huge amount left in that bottle, but it's not sort of overly oxidised or anything like that. So, I mean, I will say that it is possible that the sample is a little tired. Anyway, let's see what the parts are. I mean, I wouldn't have had that down as Fettercairn. I mean, it's very soft, it's very citric. The greenness kind of comes through more as a grassiness than a sort of a vegetal greenness. A bit of barley, it's okay. It's not going to blow you away. Like I said, it's a sort of a very okay whiskey. You know, like I said, I wouldn't have pegged it for a Fettercairn. It certainly hasn't got the intensity of the other two bottlings, which again, like I said, may well be down to the sample being a little bit tired. But from memory, I don't remember it being a sort of like one that I would rush to have stuck on the shelf. But again, you know, it's okay for a Fettercairn. Okay, so let's move on to the second Provenance, Douglas McGibbon Provenance Fettercairn 11-year-old. So let's see what the note is on this then, shall we? To be fair, very much the same as the previous one. A little bit nondescript, some barley, some citrus, no real sulphury notes, no real vegetalness, no real intensity. It's a very, you know, if one is being kind of, well, not even overly critical, but you'd call it a filler malt basically. There's not really an awful lot going on here, and so I have to kind of assume that these were obviously from 2003 and 2005. No, I was just about to say from the same batch, but they probably aren't, because obviously they've been distilled in different years. So, but it's kind of, yeah, there's not really even much oak there at all. There's not really a great deal of anything that kind of stands out and shouts Fettercairn at you. So let's see what the parts are. Actually, you know what? I was about to say I really like that palate, but a bit of a mustiness right on the aftertaste. Again, might be because that's a bit of an old sample. It's possibly again, the greenness is more sort of Sauvignon-y kind of grassiness. There's not a great deal of intensity there. It's okay. Again, pleasant. Like I said, you know, you would instantaneously would go filler malt on that one, because there really isn't anything that stands out apart from maybe a little bit of mustiness on the finish. But like I said, I think that may well be more down to the age of the sample rather than the actual quality of the spirits. So again, yep, okay. Okay, so something with a little bit of age, 14-year-old. Let's see what the nose gives us on this then, shall we? Okay, so fuller, flinty, industrial, subsulphury. I get that meaty sulphur note underneath the surface, and here we are in how sulphur spirits or sulphurous new make kind of like can end up with something with some really nice weight. I mean, you think of things like sort of Darwini and Mortlach, they do have a lovely weight, but it needs time. And so with this particular one, it would appear that once we're getting into the mid to late teens, that sulphur note is finally dissipating and becoming something a little bit more meaty and a little bit more interesting. There's a little bit of barley, a little bit of white fruit. Again, it's not a nose that sort of like gives you the wow factor or, you know, that kind of thing, but it's a perfectly acceptable nose, as they say. Let's sort of pass on. Very much like the nose, quite weighty, quite meaty, a little industrial. It's got an almost kind of mentholy kind of note on the finish. That sort of greenness has now kind of come out as a touch of menthol, which is intriguing and interesting. Some nice oak, some clean oak. Again, you know, we're not talking sort of, you know, burning rubber and all that kind of thing, so not a bad cask in itself. It's a little hot on the finish, I will say. 48% does seem to have emphasised that sort of, you know, hotness, shall we say, but yeah, not too bad. Right, okay, so on to the final whisky of the afternoon. So this is the Distillery 16-year-old. Let's see what the nose gives us on this end, shall we? Oof, that's got... Now, I was expecting this to sort of be in the sort of Distiller's Art kind of thing, you know, nice and meaty and sort of slightly soft, but no. This has got a definite rawness there, an edge to it. Definitely herbal. Slightly raw, like I said, but the spirit is kind of being masked to a certain degree by the sherry. So you're certainly getting the chunky Oloroso, a little bit of treacle, there's a touch of gooseberry kind of coming through, a little butteriness as well. I mean, actually, it's relatively complex, it has to be said. I mean, you've got, again, you know, it's quite balanced. You've got the character of the spirit, you've got the character of the oak. Again, whether you kind of like that kind of character, of course, is sort of a secondary kind of thing. Because from a technical perspective, this is actually a fairly good whisky. Like I said, it's not one that I'm going to sort of like, you know, sort of dance around the room going, my God, it's almost the greatest thing since sliced bread. But it certainly, again, it plays into sort of Richard Patterson's idea of taming the spirit to a certain extent with other casks, and certainly a little bit of age, although in this instance it doesn't seem to be the age that's done it. It does seem to be a lot younger than the 14-year-old, which, there you go, well, that's spirit for you, isn't it? That's whiskey. Anyway, let's see what the glass like. Right, so it does kick off with the oak. I'm getting the sort of the chunky Oloroso, a little bit of treacle. It's only really as we start to get into the mid palate that the spirit is starting to come through as a little herbal note. Some menthol on the finish, it's slightly industrial, a little hot, quite tannic, and it is very oak centric. The sort of like, the spirit is really pretty much encased in this sort of oak character, and so, and this is testament to sort of like, you know, the Richard Patterson treatment, and well, you can't argue with it, it works. I mean, that is actually, and I'm not going to say it's an enjoyable bottling, but it's a not bad bottling. I mean, I know 16-year-olds are, what 16-year-olds now, 70, 80 quid. I would think twice before parting with that kind of level of money for it, it has to be said. But like I said, it kind of like showcases exactly how to handle a industrial style spirit. Yeah, just chuck lots of oak at it. Right, okay, so let's sum today's episode of the show up. I guess certainly sort of looking at this selection of samples, none of them were sort of overtly sulphured and burnt rubber, kind of messy and horrible. And so it certainly seems that kind of maybe one was doing it a little bit of an injustice with regards to that. But it's not a pretty spirit whatsoever. The Hepburns choice, well, like I said, it was oak, you know, and like I said, throughout the whole episode of the show, this seems to be sort of like Richard Patterson's way of dealing with an industrial style of spirit, and it works. It works in the Hepburns choice. It works in the Distillery 16-year-old. Less successful, I think, was the Carn Moor bottling. Yes, on the nose, lots of oak, but on the palate, it kind of like didn't really last the length, shall we say. The oak kind of like came and went very quickly, and you were left with an inordinate amount of distillery character. The two Douglas McGibbon bottlings, like I said, just seemed to be fairly bland, I hate to say. They really didn't say an awful lot of anything. They were very much kind of like nondescript fillers. And although it wasn't a bad whiskey, it just wasn't particularly exciting. You know, you couldn't criticise. Well, you could criticise it for being bland. I mean, but you couldn't criticise it for being horribly industrial or horribly oaky, or it was just there. You know, if you like, and not particularly sort of, you know. Distillers Art bottling, on the other hand, I thought was actually sort of what I would expect Fettercairn at sort of like, you know, that kind of age to be. It's starting to develop the meatiness, the sulphur is kind of morphing into that meatiness, which is what you want. And this is it with regards to sort of like distilleries that produce a fairly heavily sulphured new make, that you just need to sit on it and wait. I mean, you can say that about every distillery, but you know, there is obviously commercial pressures and so on and so forth. And the 16, again, I suppose, like I said, it kind of fed into sort of Richard Patterson's idea of chucking loads of cask at it, and it worked absolutely fine. I was expecting a little bit more meatiness, which certainly wasn't there. It came across more with that sort of raw sort of greenness. But again, like I said, like the Hepburns choice bottling at the start, that seemed to be sort of how you deal with, or certainly how you deal with Fettercairn. Not necessarily every distillery that has sort of like, you know, sulphury spirit is going to be pretty much the same, but certainly adding some kind of balance, some sweetness, certainly seems to be the way to go. So anyway, I think this has been a fun episode. I think it's been a kind of an educational episode. Don't think I'm going to be doing a Deanston episode of the show next week. Well, I don't have enough samples to, but I think 2 episodes on the trot of sort of Axis of Evil, sort of pseudo Axis of Evil bottlings is kind of enough for now. So next week will be something completely different, as they say. So anyway, that's this week's episode of The Show in the Bag. I hope you've enjoyed it. So all that's left to say is good afternoon and good dramming.